When 14-year-old Malik is wrongfully accused of suspicious behavior by a mall security guard, his day quickly spirals into a public confrontation. But just as tensions peak, Malik is thrust into a life-or-death moment where he must act quickly to save a child. What happens next will force everyone, especially the guard, to confront their assumptions in ways they never expected. Could one heroic act shift a lifetime of bias? Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. It was a typical Saturday afternoon, and the mall was bustling with activity. People moved through the crowded walkways, some carrying bags of newly purchased items, others window shopping or meeting up with friends. Malik, a 14-year-old boy with a quiet disposition and a passion for technology, walked alongside his mother Sarah. They had come to the mall together, as they often did, but their routines always diverged. Sarah had a few things to pick up from the department store, while Malik, as usual, made his way toward the electronics shop. Malik was a young black boy, with a tall and athletic build that often drew attention. His eyes, filled with curiosity, always lit up when he got near the tech store. The newest laptops, headphones, and phones on display fascinated him. He had dreams of one day designing his own devices, maybe even becoming an engineer. As he approached the store, he stopped to admire a sleek new laptop featured prominently in the window. His thoughts were deep in contemplation as he imagined himself using the laptop, tinkering with software, and learning how each piece of the machine worked. Lost in his daydream, Malik didn't notice the security guard standing nearby, eyeing him with suspicion. Ted, the guard, was a man in his mid-40s, a fixture at the mall for as long as Malik could remember. Ted had been working security for over a decade, and in that time, he had seen his share of trouble. Unfortunately, his judgment had become clouded by his own biases. To Ted, Malik wasn't just a boy admiring a laptop. Ted saw Malik's skin color first and foremost, and in his mind, Malik's presence near the expensive electronics triggered an alarm. His training told him to be vigilant, but his prejudice had warped that vigilance into something darker. Ted had seen Malik in the mall before, always in the electronics store, always looking at things but never buying. In Ted's mind, this meant trouble. As Malik stood in front of the window, completely unaware of Ted's eyes on him, Ted approached slowly. He didn't come right up to Malik at first, but lingered a few feet away, watching, waiting for any reason to step in. Malik sensed a presence and turned his head slightly, noticing the guard. His heart sank. He knew this look, the stare that carried 1,000 assumptions. Malik had been taught by his mother to always remain calm in situations like this. "Don't give them a reason to escalate," she had said. "Keep your head down and remember, you're not doing anything wrong." But even knowing this, Malik could feel the weight of Ted's gaze on him. The moment was tense, and though he tried to stay composed, his palms began to sweat. He took a deep breath, hoping Ted would leave him alone if he didn't react. But Ted didn't walk away. Instead, he stepped forward, his face hardening into a stern expression. "Hey," Ted said, his voice gruff. "You've been standing here for a while. What are you doing?" Malik looked up, startled by the sudden accusation. He hadn't been there that long, certainly not long enough to cause any suspicion. He glanced around, trying to see if anyone else was being watched the way he was, but no one seemed to notice Ted's scrutiny. It was just him. "I'm just looking at the laptop," Malik replied, keeping his voice calm, though his frustration was beginning to rise. He wasn't doing anything wrong, yet he could feel the judgment in Ted's tone. Ted wasn't satisfied. He stepped closer, crossing his arms as if to assert his authority. "You've been looking for quite a while. You planning on buying something, or just hanging around?" Malik felt the sting of the question. He knew what Ted was really asking, even if he wasn't saying it outright. It wasn't about how long he had been standing there. It was about who he was. Malik's pulse quickened, but he tried to keep his voice steady. "I'm just looking," he repeated. "My mom's shopping, and I'm waiting for her." Ted didn't back down. The guard's face showed no sign of softening. He didn't believe Malik, and worse, he didn't care about Malik's innocence. To him, Malik fit the profile of someone who might cause trouble. He had made up his mind before he even approached. "You don't need to be standing around here if you're not going to buy anything," Ted said. his tone growing more hostile. "Why don't you move along?" Malik's stomach churned. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal for simply existing in a space where he apparently wasn't welcome. He wanted to push back, to tell Ted he had no right to talk to him like that, but he knew better. Sarah's warnings rang in his ears. "Stay calm. Don't make things worse." At that moment, Sarah appeared, carrying a few shopping bags in hand. Her eyes immediately caught the scene unfolding in front of the electronics store. She saw Ted standing too close to her son, his body language aggressive, and Malik standing there, looking uncomfortable but trying to remain composed. Sarah's protective instincts kicked in. She marched over, her face set in a hard line. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice sharp and direct. Ted looked at her, surprised by the sudden interruption. He wasn't expecting anyone to intervene, and for a moment he seemed taken aback. But his authority as a security guard gave him confidence, and he straightened his posture, as if preparing for a confrontation. "No problem," Ted replied, though his tone was defensive. "I was just asking your son to move along. He's been standing here for a while, and we don't want anyone causing trouble." Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. "Causing trouble?" she repeated, incredulous. "My son is standing here, minding his own business, and you're accusing him of causing trouble?" Ted shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't expected to be called out so directly. "I didn't say he was causing trouble," Ted tried to explain, though his words were weak. "I just asked him what he was doing. It's standard procedure." Sarah didn't back down. She stepped closer, her voice low but filled with intensity. "Let me tell you something," she said, her eyes locking onto Ted's. "My son is not causing trouble. He's not doing anything wrong. But you're treating him like he's guilty just because of the color of his skin." Ted's face flushed with embarrassment. He hadn't expected such a blunt accusation, and he stammered for a response. The people walking by began to slow, some turning to watch the scene unfold. Malik stood there, feeling the heat of everyone's eyes on him. He hated this, hated being the center of attention in a way that made him feel powerless and exposed. Sarah wasn't finished. "You should be ashamed of yourself," she said, her voice shaking with controlled fury. "You don't get to treat my son like this. Not today, not ever." Ted's face hardened again. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially in front of a crowd. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, something unexpected happened. As the tension between Sarah and Ted escalated, onlookers began to gather, their faces filled with curiosity, some with concern, but most with indifference. It was just another day at the mall, and for many, this was merely a passing drama. Ted, however, felt the weight of every eye on him, and his frustration grew. He hadn't signed up to be challenged in public, especially not by someone who, in his mind, was overreacting to a simple situation. At least, that's what he told himself. But deep down, Ted knew it wasn't that simple. For years he had worked as a security guard in the mall, and over time he had built up a rigid sense of who was trouble and who wasn't. It wasn't something he had consciously decided. It was more of a slow accumulation of experiences, warnings from other guards, and his own encounters. His job, he believed, was to protect the mall from potential threats. But the problem was that those threats, in his mind, often looked like Malik. Ted had grown up in a neighborhood where most people looked like him, and that sameness had followed him into adulthood. The faces he saw every day, the ones he didn't question, were familiar and comfortable. But when someone like Malik came around, someone who didn't fit into Ted's narrow world, alarm bells went off in his head. He told himself he was just being careful, that it was better to be cautious than to let something bad happen. But today, as he stood face to face with Malik and his mother, Sarah, Ted was starting to feel the cracks in his thinking. "Look," Ted said, trying to regain control of the situation. His voice was tense, and his words felt like they were coming out wrong. "I didn't mean any harm. I just saw him standing here for a while, and we've had incidents in the past. I was just doing my job." Sarah wasn't having any of it. "Your job," she repeated, her voice filled with disdain. "Your job is to harass a child for looking at a laptop? To follow him around because you've decided he's suspicious? You think that's what you're here to do?" Ted shifted uneasily. The truth was, he wasn't sure what to say. His instincts had told him that Malik was trouble, but now, confronted by Sarah's fury and the growing crowd of onlookers, those instincts felt more like excuses. He glanced around, hoping for support, but the faces in the crowd were hard to read. Some looked bored, others concerned, but none were stepping in to help him. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't anticipated. Malik stood quietly, his hands in his pockets, eyes downcast. He didn't want to be here. He didn't want to be the center of this drama. But there was no escaping it now. He had grown used to these moments, the times when he was singled out for no reason other than the fact that he didn't look like the other kids browsing the stores. His mother always told him to stay calm, to keep his head down and not make a scene. But every time it happened, it felt worse. It wasn't just the embarrassment. It was the sense of being seen as less than human, as something to be suspicious of, something to be watched. Ted, still trying to salvage the situation, looked at Malik. "Look, kid, I didn't mean to upset you," he said, though the apology sounded hollow even to his own ears. "You understand, right? I'm just looking out for the mall." Malik didn't answer. He didn't trust himself to speak. His emotions were too close to the surface, and the last thing he wanted was to give Ted more of a reason to keep pressing him. Instead, Malik kept his eyes down, wishing he could disappear. But Sarah wasn't done. "You think my son is a threat?" she demanded. "You look at him and assume that he's up to something because of the way he looks. How many other kids did you walk past today? How many other kids are standing around, doing exactly what Malik was doing, but you didn't stop them?" Ted opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah kept going, her voice rising with every word. "You've made up your mind about my son without knowing a single thing about him. And don't you dare try to tell me it's not about race? Because we both know that's exactly what this is about." Ted's face flushed with embarrassment. He wanted to argue, to tell Sarah that she was wrong, that this wasn't about race. But the words wouldn't come. He thought about the other kids he'd seen today, the ones who looked different from Malik, and how he hadn't given them a second glance. The realization stung. The crowd around them continued to grow, but no one intervened. Most people were content to watch from the sidelines, their curiosity piqued by the public confrontation. Some looked uncomfortable, while others whispered to each other, exchanging their own judgments about what was happening. Ted, feeling cornered, tried to defend himself. "I wasn't targeting him because of his race," he said, though even as he spoke the words felt flimsy. "I've had issues with other kids before. We've had problems with shoplifting and vandalism. I'm just being careful." "Careful?" Sarah shot back. Careful would have been watching from a distance, maybe asking him a question if you were truly concerned. But that's not what you did, is it? You singled him out. You assumed the worst, and now you're trying to justify it. Ted didn't know what to say. His heart was racing, and he could feel the heat rising in his face. The words Sarah was saying hit harder than he had expected. They weren't just angry accusations. They were forcing him to confront something he had never fully examined about himself. His own biases, his own assumptions about people like Malik, had guided him for so long that he hadn't even questioned them. But now, standing here with no way to deflect or deny what he had done, Ted felt an uncomfortable truth settling in. As Sarah's words hung in the air, the crowd began to shift. A few people, sensing that things were escalating, slowly started to walk away. But others stayed, their attention glued to the confrontation. Some murmured their own opinions, while others watched in silence. Malik, still standing quietly beside his mother, felt the weight of every stare. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get more tense, a loud cry pierced the air from across the mall. Everyone, including Ted, Sarah, and Malik, turned in the direction of the sound. A child's voice, high-pitched and panicked, echoed through the space, and in an instant, the attention of the crowd shifted. A young child, no older than 3, had wandered too close to the railing on the upper floor of the mall. In the chaos of the busy afternoon, the child's parents hadn't noticed their toddler straying from their side. The child, fascinated by the shiny barrier, had climbed onto the edge, precariously balancing between safety and a dangerous fall. The mall's collective breath seemed to catch as people realized the imminent danger. Shouts erupted from onlookers as the parents frantically rushed toward their child, but they were too far away to reach the toddler in time. The child teetered on the edge, a second away from losing balance completely. Without thinking, Malik sprang into action. His instincts kicked in, and he bolted across the mall faster than anyone could process. His long legs carried him through the crowd, weaving between stunned shoppers as he raced toward the child. Ted, Sarah, and the entire crowd watched in disbelief as Malik moved with incredible speed and precision. Malik reached the child just as they began to tip forward. His arms shot out, grabbing the toddler around the waist and pulling them back from the edge in one swift, fluid motion. The child, startled but unharmed, began to cry as Malik held them close, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, there was silence. The entire mall seemed frozen, as if time itself had paused to witness Malik's act of bravery. Ted stood rooted to the spot, unable to process what had just happened. The boy he had just been profiling as a potential threat had, in the blink of an eye, become a hero. The mall had never been this quiet. The chaos of the bustling shoppers, the hum of conversations, and the ever-present mall music all seemed to fade away in the wake of Malik's swift action. For a brief moment, everything stopped, and the only sound was the quiet sobbing of the toddler who had been saved from a devastating fall. Malik stood there, still holding the small child close, his own heart pounding so loudly in his chest he thought everyone could hear it. His body trembled from the rush of adrenaline coursing through him. All around him, people stared in stunned silence, not quite sure how to react to what they had just witnessed. The child's parents, their faces pale and stricken with fear, finally reached Malik. They pulled the child into their arms, tears of relief spilling down their cheeks as they hugged their toddler tightly. Thank you," the mother gasped, her voice breaking. "Oh my God, thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." She choked on her words, overcome with emotion. The father, though less vocal, gave Malik a look of pure gratitude, his hands shaking as he patted Malik on the shoulder. Malik nodded, still feeling the lingering tremor in his own limbs. He couldn't find his voice, but he didn't need to. The look of relief on the parents' faces was enough for him. He had acted purely on instinct, not for praise or recognition, but because, in that moment, there had been no time to think, only to act. As the parents hugged their child, the reality of what had just happened slowly dawned on the crowd. The hushed whispers began again, but this time, they were different. They weren't murmurs of suspicion or judgment, they were expressions of amazement. People exchanged glances, shook their heads in disbelief, and some even applauded quietly, as if unsure whether such a serious moment warranted applause. From where he stood, Ted watched the entire scene unfold, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. His throat was dry, and his mind raced, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The boy he had been harassing only moments earlier, the boy he had judged based on nothing more than his appearance, had just saved a child's life. And now, Ted was left standing in the aftermath of his own prejudice, with the weight of his actions pressing down on him like never before. Ted felt a deep, uncomfortable shame settle in his chest. He had spent years doing this, profiling people, making assumptions based on skin color, age, and how they looked or dressed. It had become second nature to him, something he didn't even question anymore. But now, seeing Malik's bravery, his selflessness, Ted couldn't escape the reality of what he had done. He had misjudged Malik entirely. The realization stung. Sarah, who had been just as stunned as everyone else, now stepped forward, her expression shifting from shock to fierce pride. She walked toward her son, her head held high, her shoulders back, and stood by his side as if to shield him from the gazes of the onlookers. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle but filled with meaning. "Are you okay, baby?" she asked, her voice softening for the first time since the confrontation with Ted. Malik nodded. "I'm okay, Mom," he whispered, though his voice was still shaky. I didn't even think. I just saw the kid." "You did good, Malik. You did so good," Sarah said, squeezing his shoulder. Her voice was filled with pride and relief, but there was also an edge of sorrow in her words. Sorrow for the way her son had been treated, for the assumptions made about him, even in the face of his bravery. The parents of the child, still clutching their toddler, turned to Sarah and Malik again. The mother, her eyes filled with gratitude, approached them. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "You saved our child. I can't even begin to imagine what could have happened if you weren't there." "It's okay," Malik said quietly. "I'm just glad the kid's okay." The father nodded solemnly, looking at Malik with a deep respect that contrasted sharply with the suspicion that had filled Ted's eyes just minutes before. "You're a hero," the father said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." The word hero felt strange to Malik. He didn't see himself that way. He hadn't done anything for recognition or to be called a hero. He had acted because it was the right thing to do. Because, in that moment, nothing else had mattered. But as the parents continued to express their gratitude, Malik realized that sometimes doing the right thing meant more than he could ever understand in the moment. As the parents walked away, still holding their child tightly, the crowd slowly began to disperse. People returned to their shopping, though many of them glanced back at Malik, their expressions filled with admiration. Some whispered to each other, recounting what they had seen, while others simply walked away, lost in their own thoughts. But not everyone left. Ted remained standing a few feet away, his mind a swirling storm of guilt, confusion, and regret. He knew he needed to say something, but he didn't know how to begin. What could he possibly say to undo the harm he had caused? What words could fix the damage done by his own prejudice? Taking a deep breath, Ted forced himself to move. His legs felt heavy as he walked toward Malik and Sarah, his heart hammering in his chest. This wasn't something he could avoid. He had to face it, face them. When Ted finally reached them, Malik looked up, his face calm but guarded. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she saw the security guard approach. Her protective instincts flared again, and she stepped slightly in front of her son, her gaze hard and unflinching. Ted cleared his throat, unsure of where to start. I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice strained. It felt like the right place to begin, though it was far from what he needed to say. Sarah's eyes didn't soften. She could sense that Ted was struggling, but her patience for him had already worn thin. She didn't trust him, not after everything he had put Malik through. Malik said nothing, only watching Ted with a calm that seemed beyond his years. He wasn't angry, not in the way Ted expected him to be, but there was something in Malik's eyes that unnerved Ted. It was a quiet strength, an understanding that went deeper than words. "I was wrong," Ted finally said, his voice quieter this time. "I shouldn't have. I misjudged you. I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of what they meant. Ted's apology felt clumsy, inadequate, but it was all he could offer in that moment. He wished there was more he could say, something that could make up for the way he had treated Malik, but he knew that no amount of words could undo what had been done. Sarah stood silent for a moment, her expression unreadable. She glanced at Malik, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Malik nodded slightly, and Sarah let out a quiet sigh. "You should be sorry," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You treated my son like he was a criminal. You followed him, harassed him, humiliated him, all because of your own assumptions. And now, after he's proven you wrong, all you can offer is an apology?" Ted felt his face flush with shame. He hadn't expected forgiveness, but hearing Sarah's words made him realize just how deep his mistake had been. "I know," Ted said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't take it back. But I'm going to do better. I have to do better." Sarah studied him for a moment longer, her eyes searching for something, maybe sincerity, maybe remorse. Whatever she found, it wasn't enough to erase the pain, but it was enough for her to nod slowly. "See that you do," she said quietly. "And remember, the next time you think about profiling someone, remember what you did today. Remember who you judged." Ted nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He would remember. How could he not? The boy who had saved a life today had also changed his own in ways Ted couldn't yet fully understand. As Ted walked away, the mall returned to its usual buzz of activity. But for Ted, everything felt different. The world he thought he knew had shifted, and he was left to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that had been there all along. Ted walked away from Malik and his mother, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened bearing down on him like a heavy cloak. The words exchanged between him and Sarah, the haunting image of Malik's steady gaze, and the realization that his judgment had been so wrong were now etched into his mind. He'd always thought of himself as someone who was just doing his job, looking out for trouble, keeping people safe. But now, in the aftermath of the day's events, that narrative felt shallow, hollow even. As he made his way back to the security office, Ted couldn't shake the sense of shame that clung to him. The mall had returned to its normal buzz, with shoppers moving about their business. But for Ted, nothing felt normal anymore. His mind was swirling with thoughts, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. Truths he had ignored for far too long. In the small, dimly lit security office, Ted slumped into his chair. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the security cameras that played across multiple monitors on the wall. Ted stared at them blankly, his mind far away from the images they captured. He thought about all the times he had done this before, profiled someone, assumed the worst about them, and never once questioned why. It was easy to justify it as part of the job. Be vigilant, his training had said. Look out for suspicious behavior. But what exactly had been suspicious about Malik? Standing in front of a store, looking at a laptop, was hardly a crime. And yet, Ted had approached Malik with a sense of authority, an assumption of guilt that was based on nothing more than the color of the boy's skin. Ted hadn't realized it at the time, but now it was glaringly obvious. It wasn't Malik's behavior that had drawn his suspicion. It was the assumptions Ted had been carrying with him for years, unexamined and unchecked. His biases had built a framework in his mind, one that influenced his every action and decision. Ted had never considered himself racist. In fact, he had always believed that he treated everyone the same. But now, after the events of the day, he realized just how deeply ingrained those biases had been. The door to the security office opened, and Ted's colleague, Mark, walked in. Mark was another security guard, older than Ted, with a gruff demeanor and years of experience under his belt. He glanced at Ted, noticing the troubled look on his face. "You all right, man?" Mark asked, his voice rough but filled with concern. Ted didn't look up. "I messed up today," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark frowned, stepping closer. "What are you talking about?" Ted sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. "That kid, Malik, I judged him. I thought he was up to something just because of how he looked. I followed him around, interrogated him for no reason. And then he saved that kid. I was wrong, Mark. I've been wrong for a long time." Mark leaned against the desk, crossing his arms over his chest. He wasn't the type to offer comforting words or platitudes, but he could see that Ted was struggling. "Look, Ted," he said after a moment. "We're trained to watch for trouble. That's our job. Sometimes we make mistakes." Ted shook his head. "No, this wasn't just a mistake. I've done this before, you know. I've profiled kids like Malik before, assumed they were trouble just because they didn't look like me. And I never thought twice about it. I've been telling myself I'm just doing my job, but it's more than that. I was wrong, Mark, and now I can't stop thinking about it." Mark was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. He had worked security for longer than Ted, and in that time he had seen the same patterns: guards profiling kids, making assumptions, and treating certain people differently based on appearance alone. It was a part of the job no one liked to talk about, but it was there, beneath the surface, influencing decisions in ways that weren't always fair. "I get what you're saying," Mark said finally. "But what are you going to do about it? We've all got our biases, Ted. The question is, what are you going to do now that you see them?" Ted sat in silence, Mark's question hanging in the air like a challenge. What was he going to do? He couldn't undo what had happened. He couldn't take back the way he had treated Malik or erase the humiliation he had caused the boy. But he could change. He could start by acknowledging his own biases, by learning, by doing better. Ted knew that this wasn't just about him. It was about the system, about the way people like him were taught to see the world, to see certain people as other, as inherently suspicious. "I need to change," Ted said finally, his voice firm with resolution. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep seeing people the way I have been. I need to figure out how to be better." Mark nodded, a flicker of respect passing through his eyes. "That's a start," he said. "But don't just talk about it. You've got to follow through." Ted knew Mark was right. Words alone weren't enough. If he was going to change, he had to act on it. He had to confront his own prejudices head-on, to educate himself, to break down the barriers that had been built up in his mind over years of misguided thinking. Later that night, Ted sat at home, staring at his computer screen. He had spent hours reading articles, watching videos, and learning about unconscious bias and the effects of racial profiling. Each new piece of information was like peeling back another layer of his own ignorance, and the process was both enlightening and painful. One article, in particular, struck Ted deeply. It was a personal essay written by a black man who had experienced racial profiling throughout his life, at the store, at work, even in his own neighborhood. The man wrote about how each encounter had left a mark on him, how it had eroded his sense of safety and dignity over time. Ted couldn't stop thinking about Malik as he read the man's words. Had Malik felt that same sense of being constantly watched, constantly judged? Had Ted contributed to that? The weight of his actions pressed down on Ted harder than ever before. The next day, Ted made a decision. He wasn't going to let this be just another lesson learned and forgotten. He was going to actively work on being better, not just for himself, but for the people he interacted with every day. He reached out to the mall management, requesting that they implement bias training for the security team, a program that would help other guards recognize and confront their own unconscious biases. It wasn't enough, but it was a step in the right direction. He also decided to reach out to Malik. He didn't know how the boy would respond, but Ted felt he owed him more than just a passing apology. He wanted to talk to Malik, to understand him better, to show that he was committed to change. When Ted finally saw Malik again at the mall, it was a few days after the incident. Malik was walking with his mother, and they seemed more at ease this time, though there was still a wariness in the way Sarah glanced around. Ted approached them cautiously, not wanting to intrude, but knowing he needed to say something. When Malik saw him, there was a flicker of recognition in the boy's eyes, but he didn't speak. Sarah, however, stiffened slightly, her protective instincts still sharp. "Hi," Ted said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I just wanted to say again, I'm sorry, and I'm not just saying that. I've been thinking a lot about what happened. I've been learning, and I want you to know that I'm working on being better." Malik studied him for a moment, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Thanks," he said quietly. "I hope you mean it." "I do," Ted said. "I really do." Sarah, still wary but sensing Ted's sincerity, softened slightly. "We'll see," she said. "It's not about words, it's about actions." Ted nodded. He knew she was right. It wasn't enough to apologize. It wasn't enough to promise to change. He had to prove it, every day, in every interaction. As Ted walked away, he felt lighter, not because everything was fixed, but because he had finally taken responsibility for his actions. He had finally opened his eyes to the biases that had controlled his life for so long, and now he was determined to do the work to change. Several months passed after the incident at the mall. For Malik, life slowly returned to its usual rhythm. He went back to school, spent time with his friends, and continued visiting the mall with his mother on weekends. But something had shifted within him. He felt a new sense of self-awareness, a deeper understanding of the world and the way people perceived him. The experience with Ted had left a lasting mark, not in a way that weighed him down, but in a way that empowered him. He had stood his ground in the face of injustice, and more importantly, he had shown compassion when others had failed to show him the same. For Sarah, the months following the incident were filled with a mix of pride and frustration. She was immensely proud of Malik for his bravery and his ability to remain calm despite being unfairly judged. But she also felt a lingering anger toward the way her son had been treated. She knew this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a reflection of the world they lived in, a world where Malik and others like him would continue to face the burden of prejudice. Still, she took solace in knowing that Malik had not let that experience break him. If anything, it had made him stronger. Ted, on the other hand, had undergone a profound transformation. In the weeks and months after the incident, he had thrown himself into learning about racial bias, prejudice, and systemic discrimination. He attended workshops, read extensively, and participated in discussions aimed at unlearning the harmful biases he had carried for so long. Ted knew that this journey would be ongoing, but he was committed to it. His apology to Malik had been the beginning, not the end. The mall management had also taken steps to address the incident. Ted's request for bias training had been implemented, and the security team underwent regular sessions to help them recognize and confront their own unconscious prejudices. Ted became a vocal advocate for change within the team, often sharing his own experience as a cautionary tale. While not everyone was as open to change as Ted, the atmosphere among the security staff slowly began to shift. There was a growing awareness of the need to treat everyone fairly, regardless of appearance. One Saturday afternoon, several months after the incident, Malik and Sarah found themselves back at the mall, following their usual routine. Malik, as always, made his way toward the electronics store while Sarah went off to do some shopping. But this time, there was no anxiety hanging over Malik as he approached the store. There was no feeling of being watched, no sense of dread. It was just a normal day, and for once, Malik felt free to simply be. As Malik browsed through the gadgets on display, he felt a familiar presence nearby. Looking up, he saw Ted walking toward him. Though this time, there was no suspicion in the security guard's eyes, only a quiet acknowledgement. Ted offered Malik a small, almost shy smile, and Malik nodded in return. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a sense of mutual respect that hadn't existed before. Ted hesitated for a moment, then approached Malik. "Hey," he said, his voice calm and friendly. "How's it going?" Malik glanced up from the tablet he was looking at. "I'm good," he said, his tone casual but not unfriendly. Ted nodded, awkwardly shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He still felt uncomfortable around Malik, not because of Malik himself, but because of the guilt that lingered from the way he had treated him months earlier. Yet, Ted knew he couldn't let that guilt paralyze him. If he was going to be better, he had to keep trying. "I just wanted to check in," Ted continued. "I know we haven't really talked much since everything that happened, but I've been thinking about it a lot. And I want you to know that I'm still learning, still trying to do better." Malik studied Ted for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I can see that," he said. "It's good that you're trying." There was a pause, the silence between them filled with the hum of shoppers passing by. Ted took a deep breath. "I want you to know," he said, "that I'm not just doing this for you, or to make myself feel better. I'm doing this because I realized how much harm I've done, not just to you, but to others too. I've spent years making assumptions about people, judging them based on things I had no right to judge, and I'm trying to change that." Malik didn't say anything at first. He wasn't sure how to respond to such a vulnerable admission, but as he looked at Ted, he saw something that hadn't been there before: sincerity. Malik could tell that Ted wasn't just saying what he thought Malik wanted to hear. He was speaking from a place of genuine self-reflection, and that mattered. "I appreciate that," Malik finally said. "It takes a lot to admit when you're wrong." Ted exhaled as if relieved by Malik's response. "It does," he admitted. "But it's important. I've learned that the hard way." Malik nodded. "Yeah, I get it." The conversation could have ended there, but there was something else Ted needed to say. "You know, Malik," Ted began, his voice softer now, "I don't think I ever really thanked you properly for what you did that day. You saved that kid's life, and I know I didn't deserve to see it, not after how I treated you. But I'm grateful, not just for saving the child, but for showing me that I was wrong." Malik met Ted's eyes, seeing the weight of his words. "You don't have to thank me," he said quietly. "I did what anyone would have done. It doesn't matter what happened before. That kid needed help, and I was there." Ted smiled, though there was still a sadness in his eyes. "Maybe so," he said, "but not everyone would have reacted the way you did. You showed a lot of character that day. More than I did, that's for sure." There was a pause, and then Malik, sensing the sincerity in Ted's words, offered a small smile of his own. "Thanks," he said. "I appreciate that." For a moment, the two stood there in a comfortable silence, the past between them acknowledged, but no longer heavy with tension. Ted could feel the shift in their dynamic, the bridge that had begun to form between them. It wasn't a bridge built on words alone, but on actions, on the work that Ted had committed himself to and the strength that Malik had shown. As the conversation came to a natural end, Ted offered Malik a nod of respect. "If you ever need anything, you know where to find me," he said before turning and walking away, leaving Malik to continue his browsing. Malik watched Ted go, a strange sense of peace settling over him. The confrontation months ago had left him shaken, but now, standing in the same place where it had all begun, Malik felt a sense of closure. Ted had changed. The system that had once targeted him was slowly changing too. And while the world was far from perfect, Malik knew that this was a step in the right direction. Later, as Malik and Sarah left the mall, the sun was setting, casting a warm golden light across the parking lot. Malik felt lighter, as if the weight of that day had finally been lifted. His mother glanced at him, sensing the change in his mood. "How are you feeling?" she asked. Malik thought about it for a moment, then smiled. "Better," he said. "A lot better." Sarah nodded, pleased to see her son at peace. "I'm proud of you, Malik," she said softly. "You handled everything with so much grace. You're stronger than you know." Malik looked at his mother, feeling a surge of gratitude for her unwavering support. "Thanks, Mom," he said. "I couldn't have done it without you." As they walked toward the car, Malik felt a sense of calm wash over him. The world, with all its imperfections and injustices, was still there. But so was he, standing tall, knowing that he had the power to shape his own path. And as for Ted, well, Malik believed in karma. And karma, as it turned out, had a way of bringing everything full circle. Ted had learned his lesson not through punishment, but through the quiet, steady force of truth. And in the end, that was more powerful than any words of judgment. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.